Reading from Prabhupāda-līlāmṛta, Volume 1, Chapter 20, continuation. Walking back home in the early evening, past the shops and crowded tenements, followed by more than a dozen interested new people from the park, the Swami again sustained occasional shouts and taunts. But those who followed him from the park were still feeling the aura of an ecstasy that easily tolerated a few taunts from the street. Prabhupada especially was undisturbed. As he walked with his head high, not speaking, he was gravely absorbed in his thoughts, and yet his eyes actively noticed people and places and exchanges glances with those whom he passed on his way along 7th Street, past the churches and funeral homes, across First Avenue to the noisy, heavily trafficked Second Avenue, then down Second past liquor stores, coin laundries, delicatessens, past the Iglesia Alianza Cristiana Missionary, the Kohinoor Intercontinental Restaurant Palace, then past the Church of the Nativity, and finally back home to number 26. There was a crowd of people from the park standing on the sidewalks outside the storefront, young people waiting for him to arrive and unlock the door to matchless gifts. They wanted to know more about the dance and the chant on the elderly Swami and his disciples who have created such a beautiful scene in the park. They filled the storefront. Outside on the sidewalk, the timid or uncommitted loitered near the door or window, smoking and waiting or peering in and trying to see the paintings on the wall. Swamiji entered and walked directly to his dais and sat down before the largest gathering that had ever graced his temple. He spoke further of Krishna consciousness, the words coming as naturally as breathing as he quoted the Sanskrit authority that behind what they had all been experiencing in the park. Just as they had all chanted together, he said, so everyone should chant always. A long haired girl sitting close to Swamiji's dais raised her hand and asked, seemingly in trance, when I am chanting, I feel a great concentration of energy on my forehead, and then a buzzing comes and a reddish light. Just keep on chanting. Swamiji replied. It will clear up. Well, what does the chanting produce? She seemed to be coming out of her trance now. Chanting produces chanting, he replied. Just as when you are calling the name of your beloved, if there is someone you love very much, then you want to repeat his name again and again. It is out of love. A man spoke up without raising his hand. But isn't it just a kind of hypnotism on sound? Like if I chanted Coca Cola over and over, wouldn't it be the same? No, Prabhupada replied. You take any word, repeat it for 10 minutes. You will feel disgusted. But when you chant 24 hours, and but we chant 24 hours and we don't feel tired. Oh, we feel new energy. The questions seemed more relevant today. The guests had all been chanting in the park and now they were probing philosophically into what they had experienced. The Swami's followers marked this as a victory and they felt some responsibility as hosts and guides for the others. Swamiji had asked Kirtanananda to prepare some prasadam for the guests, and soon Kirtanananda appeared with small paper cups of sweet rice for everyone. The chanting process is just to cleanse the mind, said Prabhupada. We have so many misunderstandings about ourselves, about this world, about God, and about the relationships between these things. We have so many misgivings. This chanting will help to cleanse the mind. Then you will understand that this chanting is not different from Krishna. A boy who was accompanying the long haired girl spoke out incoherently. Yes, no, I. Prabhupada, yes, yes, yes. In the beginning, we have to chant. We may be in whatever position we are. It doesn't matter. If you begin chanting, the first benefit will be Sito Cheto Darpana Marjanam. The mind will be clear of all dirty things. And the next stage will be that the miseries of this material world will subside. Boy, well, I don't quite understand what the material world is because, Prabhupada, the material world is full of sufferings and miseries. Don't you understand that? Are you happy? Boy, sometimes I'm happy, sometimes I'm not. Prabhupada, no, you are not happy. That sometimes is your imagination. Just like a diseased man says, "Oh, yes, I am well." What is that well? He is going to die and he is well? Boy, I don't claim any ultimate happiness. Prabhupada, no, you do not know what happiness is, boy, but it's greater or lesser. Prabhupada, yes, you do not know what is happiness. An older man standing with his arms folded near the rear of the temple. Well, of course, that sorrow or that suffering might add the spice to make the suffering that goes in between seem happiness. Prabhupada, no. The thing is that there are different kinds of miseries that we are all that we all understand. It is only due to our ignorance that we don't care for it. Just like a man who is suffering for a long time, he has forgotten what is real happiness. Similarly, the sufferings are there already, for example, and he directed himself to the young man with his girlfriend. Take, for example, that you are a young man. Now, would you like to become an old man? Boy, I will become an old man in process of proper. You will become means you will be forced to become an old man, but you don't like to become an old man. Boy, I am going to be forced to become an old man. Yes, yes, forced. You will be forced. I don't see why. If you, Prabhupada, if you don't want to become an old man, you will be forced to become an old man. Boy, it's one of the conditions of Prabhupada. Yes, that condition is miserable. Boy, I find it not miserable, Prabhupada, because you are a young man. But ask any old man how he is suffering. You see, a deceased man, do you want to be deceased? Boy, I wouldn't search it out. Prabhupada, I wouldn't search it out. Prabhupada, no, no, just answer me. Do you like to be deceased? What is disease? Prabhupada, just answer. Boy, what is disease? Prabhupada, oh, you have never suffered from disease. You have never suffered from disease. Prabhupada looks dramatically incredulous. Boy, I have had. I have had the mumps and measles and whooping cough, which is what everyone has, and you get over it. Some people in the audience laugh. Prabhupada, everyone may be suffering, but that does not mean that it is not suffering. We have to admit that we are always in suffering. Boy, if I have never known happiness, I feel sure I have never known suffering either. Prabhupada, that is due to your ignorance. We are in suffering. We don't want to die, but death is there. We don't want to be deceased, but disease is there. We don't want to become old. Old age is there. We don't want so many things, but they are forced upon us, and any sane man will admit that these are sufferings. But if you are accustomed to take these sufferings, then you say it all right. But any sane man won't like to be deceased. He won't like to be old, and he won't like to die. Why do you have this peace movement? Because if there is war, there will be death. So people are afraid. They are making agitation. There should be no war. Do you think that death is a very pleasurable thing? Boy, I have never experienced. You have experienced and forgotten. Many times you have died. You have experienced it, but you have forgotten. Forgetfulness is no excuse. Suppose a child forgot such some suffering. That does not mean he did not suffer. Boy, no, I agree. I agree. Prabhupada, yes. So suffering is there. You have to take direction from realized souls from the authorities. Just like in the Bhagavad Gita, it is said, Dukkhalayam Ashashvatam. This world is full of miseries. So one has to realize it. Unless we understand that this place is miserable, there is no question of how to get out of it. A person who doesn't develop this understanding is not fully developed. Just like the animals, they do not understand what misery is. They are satisfied. It was late when he finally returned to his apartment. One of the boys brought him a cup of hot milk, and someone remarked they should do the chanting in the park every week. Every day, he replied. Every while, even while half a dozen people were present, he lay down on his thin mat. He continued to speak for some minutes, and then his voice trailed off, preaching in fragmented words. He appeared to doze. It was 10 o'clock. They tiptoed out, softly shutting the door. October 10. It was early. Swamiji had not yet come down for class, and the sun had not yet risen. Satswarupa and Kirtanananda sat on the floor of the storefront reading a clipping from the Morning Times. Satswarupa, has the Swami seen it? Kirtanananda, yes, just a few minutes ago. He said it's very important. It's historic. He especially liked that it was the New York Times Satsvarupa reading aloud. Swami's flock chants in park to find ecstasy. 50 followers clap and sway to hypnotic music at East Side ceremony. Sitting under a tree in Lower East Side Park and occasionally dancing, 50 followers of Hindu Swami repeated a 16-word chant for 2 hours yesterday. It was more than 2 hours. For 2 hours yesterday afternoon, to the accompaniment of cymbals, tambourines, sticks, drum bells, and a small reed organ. Repetition of the chant Swami A.C. Bhaktivedanta says is the best way to achieve self-realization in this age of destruction. While children played on Hill, a pile of dirt in the middle of Tompkins Square Park. Hovings Hill? Kirtanananda. I think it is a joke named after the park's commissioner, Satswarupa. Oh, Hovings Hill, a pile of dirt on the middle of Tompkins Square Park, or bicycled along the sunny walks. Many in the crowd of about 100 persons standing around the chanters found themselves swaying to or clapping hands in time to the hypnotic rhythmic music. It brings a state of ecstasy, said Allen Ginsberg, the poet, who was one of the celebrants. For one thing, Allen Ginsberg said, the syllables force yoga breath control. That's one psychological explanation. Satswarupa and Kirtanananda laughing. That's nonsense. The ecstasy of the chant or the mantra Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Kirtanananda. The Swami said that's the best part because they have printed the mantra, it's all perfect. Whoever reads this can be purified just the same as if they had chanted. Satswarupa continuing has replaced LSD and other drugs for many of the Swami's followers. Mr. Ginsberg said he explained that Hare Krishna pronounced Hare is the name for Vishnu, a Hindu god, as the bringer of light. Rama, pronounced Rama, is incarnation of Vishnu as the prince of responsibility. What? Where did he get that? It sounds like something out of an encyclopedia. The chant therefore names different aspects of God, Mr. Ginsberg said. Why so much from Mr. Ginsberg? Why not Swamiji? Another celebrant, 26-year-old Howard M. Wheeler, who described himself as a former English instructor at Ohio State University, now devoting his full time to the Swami, said, I myself took 50 doses of LSD and a dozen of peyote in 2 years and now nothing. Laughter. The Swami orders his followers to give up all intoxication, including coffee, tea, and cigarettes. He said in an interview from after the ceremony, in this sense, we are helping our government. He added, however, he indicated the government apparently has not appreciated this help sufficiently, but the Department of Immigration recently told Swami Bhaktivedanta that his 1 year visa, a visitor's visa, had expired and that he must leave. He said, the case is being appealed. The Swami, a, swart, a swarthy man with short cropped grayish hair and clad in a salmon colored robe over a pink sweater, said that when he first met his own teacher or guru in 1922, he was told to spread the cult of Krishna to the Western countries through the English language. Therefore, in this old age 71, I have taken so much risk. It says that we are going to come there and chant every Sunday. His followers include some social workers. I guess that's me. Kirtanananda, I think this article will bring a lot of new people. The Swami came down for class. The morning was chilly and he wore a peach colored turtleneck jersey his disciples had brought for him at a shop on Orchard Street. They had also started wearing such jerseys, a kind of unofficial uniform. Swamiji didn't mention the Times article. He began singing the Sanskrit prayers, Vandeham Shri Guru. I offer my obeisances to my spiritual master. Then he began singing Hare Krishna, and the boys joined in sing softly. Prabhupada cautioned them. But no sooner had he spoken than water began pouring down through the cracks in the ceiling. The man upstairs didn't like early morning kirtans and he began stomping his feet to show that this flood was no accident. What is this? Prabhupada looked up, disturbed, but with a touch of amusement. The boys looked around. Water was pouring down in several places. Get some pots, he said. A boy ran upstairs to Swamiji's apartment to get pots from the kitchen. Soon, three pots were catching the water as it dripped in three separate places. How does he do it? Asked Umapati. Is he pouring water onto the floor? Prabhupada asked Brahmananda to go up and speak to the man to tell him that Kirtana would be a quiet one. Then he asked everyone to sit back down amid the dripping and the pots and continue chanting softly. He said softly. That evening the temple was filled with guests. It is so much kindness of the Supreme Lord, Prabhupada said, that he wants to associate with you, so you should receive him. Always chant Hare Krishna. Now, language is Sanskrit, and some of you do not know the meaning. Still, it is so attractive that when we chanted Hare Krishna in the park, oh, old ladies, gentlemen, boys, and girls all took part. But there are also complaints, just like we are receiving daily reports that our Sankirtan movement is disturbing some tenets here. Ravindra Swarup was walking down Second Avenue on his way to the Swami's morning class when an acquaintance came out of Gem's Spa Candy and News Store and said, "Hey, your Swami is in the newspaper. Did you see?" "Yeah," Ravindra Swarup replied. "The New York Times." "No," his friend said, "today." And he held up a copy of latest edition of the East Village Other. The front page was filled with a two-color photo of the Swami, his hands folded decorously at his waist, standing in yellow robes in front of the big tree in Tompkins Square Park. He was speaking to a small crowd that had gathered around, and his disciples were at his feet. The big steeple of Saint Brigade's formed a silhouette behind him. Above the photo was a single headline, Save Earth Now, and beneath was the mantra Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Below the mantra were the words, See Centerfold. That was the whole front page. Ravindra Swarup took the newspaper and opened to the center where he found a long article and a large photo of the Swamiji with his left hand on his head, grinning blissfully in an unusual casual movement. His friend gave him the paper and Ravindra Swarup hurried to Swamiji. When he reached the storefront, several boys were along with him to show Swamiji the paper. Look, Ravindra Swarup handed it over. This is the biggest local newspaper. Everybody reads it. Prabhupada opened his eyes wide. He read aloud, Save Earth Now. And he looked up at the faces of the boys. Umapati and Hayagriva wondered aloud what it meant. Save Earth Now. Was it an ecological pun? Was it a reference to starving of nuclear disaster? Was it poking fun at Swamiji's evangelism? Well, said Umapati, after all, this is the East Village Other. It could mean anything. Swamiji is saving the earth, Kirtanananda said. We are trying to, Prabhupada replied. By Krishna's grace, methodically, he put on the eyeglasses he usually reserved for reading the Bhagavatam and carefully ap- ap- appraised the page from top to bottom. The newspaper looked incongruous in his hands. Then he began turning the pages. He stopped at the centerfold and looked at the picture of himself and laughed, then paused, studying the article. So, he said, read it. He handed the paper to Hayagriva. Once upon a time, Hayagriva began loudly. It was a fanciful story of a group of theologians who had killed an old man in a church and of the subsequent press report that God was now dead. But the story went on. Some people didn't believe it. They had dug up the body and found it to be not the body of God, but that of his PR man, organized religion. At once, the good tidings swept across the wide world. God lives. But where was God? Hayagriva read dramatically to an enthralled group. A full page ad in the New York Times offering a reward for information leading to the discovery of whereabouts of God and signed by Martin Luther King and Ronald Reagan brought no response. People began to worry and wonder again. God, said some people, lives in sugar cube. Others whispered that the sacred secret was in cigarette. But while all this was going on, an old man, his allot 1 year past his allotted 3 score and 10, wandered into he knew where God could be found. In only 3 months, the man, Swami A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami, succeeded in convincing the world's toughest audience, bohemians, acid heads, pot heads, and hippies, that he knew the way to the God. Turn off, sing out, and fall in. This new brand of holy man, with all his due deference to Dr. Leary, has come forth with a brand of consciousness expansion that's sweeter than acid, cheaper than pot, and non-bustable by fuzz. How is all this possible? Through Krishna, the Swami says. The boys broke into cheers and applause. Achyutananda apologized to Swamiji for the language of the article. It's a hippie newspaper. That's all right, said Prabhupada. He has written it in his own way. But he has said that we are giving God. They are saying that God is dead, but it is false. We are directly presenting here is God. Who can deny it? So many theologians and people may say there is no God, but Vaishnava hands God over to you freely as a commodity. Here is God. So he has marked this. It is very good. Save this paper. It is very important. The article was long. For cynical New Yorker, it says living, visible, tangible proof can be found at 26 Second Avenue, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday between 7 and 9. The article described the evening kirtanas quoted from Prabhupada's lectures and mentioned a rhythmic, hypnotic 16-word chant, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare, sung for hours on end to the accompaniments of hand clapping, cymbals, and bells. Swamiji said that simply began because the mantra was there, the article was perfect. The article also included testimony from the Swami's disciple. I started chanting to myself like the Swami said when I was walking down the street, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare, over and over, and suddenly everything started looking so beautiful. The kids, the old men, the women, even the creeks looked beautiful. To say nothing of the trees and flowers, it was like I had taken a dozen doses of LSD. But I knew there was a difference. There's no coming down from this. I can always do this anytime, anywhere. It is always with you. Without sarcasm, the article referred to the Swami's discipline forbidding coffee, tea, meat, eggs, and cigarettes. To say nothing of marijuana, LSD, alcohol, and illicit sex. Obviously, the author admired Swamiji. The energetic old man, a leading exponent of the philosophy of personalism, which holds that the one God is a person, but that his form is spiritual. The article ended with a hint that Tompkins Square Park would see similar spiritual happenings each weekend. There in the shadow of Hovings Hill, God lives in a trance-like dance and chant. October 12th, it was to be a love pigeon rally marking California's new law prohibiting the possession of LSD. The rally's promoters urged everyone to come to Tompkins Square Park in elaborate dress. Although the devotees had nothing to do with LSD laws, they took the rally as another opportunity to popularize the chanting of Hare Krishna. So they went with the Swami's blessings, carrying finger cymbals and a homemade tambourine. The devotees looked plain in their dark jeans and white, lightweight jack, zippered jackets. All around them, the dress was extravagant, tie-dyed shirts, tie-bleached jeans, um, period costumes, painted faces. There was even a circus clown, Tuli Kupferberg of the Fug rock band carried an American flag with the stars rearranged to spell love. But so far the rally had been a dud, just a strange set of drugged young people milling near the large tree where Swamiji had chanted and spoken just a few days before. Swamiji's boys made their way through the crowd to the central spot and started chanting Hare Krishna. A crowd pressed in close around them. Everyone seemed to be in friendly spirit, just unorganized, without any purpose. The idea behind the rally had been to show love and pageant of LSD vision, but not much had been happening. Someone was walking around with a bucket of burning incense. Some hippies sat back on the park benches, watching everything through colored glasses. But the kirtan was attractive, and soon a crowd gathered around the boys as they chanted. Kirtanananda, his shaved head covered with a knit skull cap, stood beside tall Jagannath, who, with his dark framed glasses and wavy hair, looked like a great horn owl playing hand cymbals. Umapati, also playing hand cymbals, looked thoughtful. Brahmananda sat on the ground in front of them, his eyes closed and his mouth widely open, chanting Hare Krishna. Beside him and looking moody sat Raphael, and next to him, ascetically thin-faced Ravindra Swarup. Close by, a policeman stood watching. The hippies began to pick up the chanting. They had come together, but there had been no center, no lecture, no amplified music. But now they began clapping and swaying, getting into the chanting as if it were their single purpose. The chanting grew stronger, and after an hour, the group broke into a spontaneous dance, joining hands and singing out Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Ram, Hare Hare. They skipped and danced together, circling the tree and Swamiji's disciples. To the hippies, it was in fact a love pageant rally, and they had found the love and peace they were searching for. It was in this mantra, Hare Krishna, had become their anthem, their reason for coming together. The life of love pageant rally. They didn't know exactly what the mantra was, but they accepted it as something deep within the soul, a metaphysical vibration. They tuned into it. Even the clown began chanting and dancing. Only the policeman remained aloof and sober, though he also could see that the new demonstration would be a peaceful one. The dance continued, and only impending dusk brought the love pageant rally to a close. The devotees hurried back to the Swamiji to tell him all that happened. He had been sitting at his desk translating the Srimad Bhagavatam. Although he had not been physically present at Kirtan, his disciples had acted on his instruction. So even without leaving his room, he was spreading the chanting of the Hare Krishna. Now he sat waiting for the report. They burst into his room with shining eyes, flushed faces, and hoarse voices, relating the good news. Not only had they dutifully chanted, but hundreds of people had joined them and sung and danced in a big circle in a spirit of unity. Swamiji, you should have been, you should have seen, Brahmananda exclaimed, his voice now exhausted from chanting. It was fantastic, fantastic. Prabhupada looked from one face to another, and he also became like them, elated and hopeful that the chanting could go on like this. They had proved, proved that their chanting of Hare Krishna could lead the love and peace movement. It could grow, and hundreds could take part. It is up to you to spread this chanting. Swamiji told them, I am an old man, but you are young. You can do it. October 13. The village voice ran four large photographs of pageant rally. The article stated, the backbone of the celebration was the mantras, holy chants from the Sanskrit Bhagavad Gita, and for 3 hours it became like a boat on a sea of rhythmic chanting. Led by 15 disciples of Bhakti Vedanta Swami, who operates from a storefront on 2nd Avenue, the mantras ebbed and flowed with the rhythms of drums, flutes, and soda cap uh, tambourine. October 18. It was Sunday, and again they went to Tompkins Square Park. Swamiji played the bongo as before, striking the drum head deftly as ever, his nimble fingers creating drum rolls as he sat on the rug in the autumn afternoon. His authentic melodic voice recited the praise to previous spiritual masters Bhaktivedanta, Bhaktivinod, Gaurakishore, Bhakti Siddhanta, the centuries old disciplic succession of which he was the living representative. Now, in the 1960s, in his remote part of the world, he sang their names in duty, deference, and love as their servants. He sat surrounded by his American followers under the tall oak tree amid the maze like fences of the park. And the same magic occurred. This time the hippies came by with more ease and familiarity. Allen Ginsberg came again, and 100 others gathered as Prabhupada loudly sang Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Of the hundreds who came by, some stayed briefly and they left. Some decided to listen and chant for a few minutes or even for the entire afternoon. And a few, very few, marked their encounter with the Swami as an unforgettable change in their life. Bob Serens was looking for the Swami. He was walking with his stylishly dressed wife and a 2-year-old son, Eric. Bob was 26-year-old and worked as a supervisor in the New York City Welfare Department. He had grown up in Washington, D.C., where he had met his wife. He had a full face and broad forehead, a clear voice, steady eyes. Bob, after I graduated from George Washington University, I decided to go straight to what I thought was the heart of the material world, New York City, to seek out whatever was the highest truth. I ended up living around the corner from the first East Village head shop. Bob didn't think his job as a social worker really helped anyone. His clients over the years seemed to maintain their same outlook and habits. He and his wife frequented West Village coffee houses, had attended lectures by Larry and Alpert on expanded consciousness, and had taken part in a recent peace march. Bob had come to feel that his aspirations for a master's degree and a better apartment were unfulfilling, and he was looking for something more. Bob, I heard about the I Ching, a book that was supposed to chart a person's course in life. So I got someone to do a reading for me. The direction was push upward through darkness. I took it as a good sign, a spiritual sign. Then I purchased it the East Village other, and I saw the article entitled Save Earth Now. There was a picture of the Swami. I had read in a book by a Sikh teacher that there could be no higher knowledge without a spiritual master. Every morning on his way to work, Bob used to pass by the Swami's storefront. Curious, he stopped once and peered in the window, only to find an empty room with some straw mats on the floor and one of the Swami's boys. Oh, these people are Buddhists, he thought. The door had been open and the boy came over and invited him in. No, thanks, he said, thinking, I don't want anything to do with Buddhism. And he went on to his job. In a head shop one day, he had picked up one of the Swami's Bhagavatams, looked through it, but he thought it was too advanced, so he put it back down. After he read the article in the East Village Other, his interest increased. He thought that today might be the last Sunday of the chanting in the park before the cold weather came. And so he went to the park hoping to find the Swami and his chanters. His wife was beside him, pushing Eric in a stroller when he heard the ching ching of the hand cymbals and a chorus of rhythmic chanting from the south side of the park. Thinking it must be the Swami, he followed the sound while his wife took Eric to the play on the swings. Alone now, Bob drew closer, moving into the crowd until he could see the Kirtan party and the Swami is sitting under the tree. Bob stood among a crowd of hundreds unnoticed. Everything is happening because of me, thought 19-year-old Judy Koslovsky. Everything I see is my own uh, creation, and I am the supreme. Everything is mine. As the thought of being God obsessed her, Judy forgot her father and everything else. She was confused. If I am God, why can't I control everything? And why am I fearful on LSD? Judy was a student at the City College of New York, majoring in art and history. She was taking guitar lessons from Reverend Gary Davis, the blues singer and Christian preacher who was teaching her the art of sad soul music. Today, however, under the influence of LSD, she had the overwhelming impression that she was God. She had had a fight with her father, who seemed cold and distant to her and couldn't understand her, and she had left her parents' home in the Bronx and traveled downtown. She was going to visit a girlfriend, and Tompkins Square Park happened to be on the way. When she reached the park, the kirtan was going on, but she couldn't see much because of the crowd. She waved her way in the closer until she could see some men, one shaven headed, several bearded, dancing with upraised hands, and in the center she saw the Swami sitting on the rug playing his drum. Dan Clark was 25, thin, intense, horn rim, bespectacled, and avant-garde filmmaker, and his first film was entitled Rebirth. He was a conscientious objector to the Vietnam War and was working at a home for children as alternative governmental service. He had been a member of SDS and the War Resisters League. He had been arrested during a protest demonstration, and he had been suspended 1 week from his job for wearing a peace button, a black armed band. He was into Buddhism, but he had lately been adding a little psychedelic seasoning. Everything is nothing and nothing is everything was his slogan, and he would go around chanting it like a mantra. But he was feeling that, at least psychologically, he needed a devotional tonic. His voidistic meditation was getting stale. Dan had come to the park today looking for the Swami and the chanting he had read about the East Village other. He had seen the Swami before one evening a few months back. He had been waiting for a bus across the street from the Swami storefront. He was on the way to a rehearsal for a mixed media show, and his friend had gone into Sam's luncheonette for a moment. Then he noticed that in the storefront, an orange robed Indian man was a shaved head was lecturing to a small group of young people. Then, when I saw him, I imagined myself walking across the street, going into the storefront, sitting down, and renouncing all worldly connections. But I thought to myself, it's only my imagination. After all, I am married and I am on my way to rehearsal, and I don't know anything about the Swami anyway. So my friend and I got on the bus. But Dan lived only a few blocks away from the storefront, and now and then he would pass by. Once he had stood for several minutes on the sidewalk looking at the cover of Srimad Bhagavatam taped onto the window. Dan, it showed an oval lotus with planets around it, and right then I was introduced to the idea of Swami of spiritual sensuality. And when I saw the painting of Lord Chaitanya and his associates in the window, that really threw me. I thought, yes, this is what I need, juice. Dan and his wife walked the paved pathway through the park. He was looking around for the Swami, but he didn't know what huh? really know what to look for. He expected to see robes and hear Buddhist style chanting, but he couldn't find anything. He had given up his search and was wandering around to see what musicians were there when he noticed a big crowd gathered around what he figured much must have been some musicians. He was attracted by the beat of their music, chimming 1 2 3, 1 2 3, a simple rhythm with a kind of flamboyance and very magnetic. He saw an occasional upraised arm above the crowd, and he thought there must be a flamenco dancing going on inside the circle. He then got wind of a drifting melody, certainly not flamenco, which accompanied the beat, and this attracted him further. He approached closer and closer, making his way through the crowd. Then he saw people chanting and others dancing and waving their arms in what he took to be blend of American, Indian, and Asian dance. It looked like something from a long forgotten era. Dan decided that this must be the Hare Krishna group, but there were no ropes, just the regular dress of lower east side. And where was the Swami? Then he saw him sitting inconspicuous, playing a little drum. His eyes were closed and his brow was knit with concentration. Dan, the Swami wasn't calling attention to himself, and at first I did attribute any importance to an elderly Indian man sitting off to one side. He didn't seem to have any special function in the chanting, but it gradually dawned on me who was he? He was the same Swami I had read about in the newspaper and seen in the storefront. After a while, he spoke, but I couldn't hear him. Still, I was impressed that he was very modest person, not interested in getting himself up on the pedestal. He didn't go strutting around, but was still with inner peace, strength, and knowledge. Bob, all his disciples were there around his feet. They were chanting, and I tried to chant along and learn the mantra too. I had heard the chanting of Hare Krishna once before at a peace march, and I had found it very beautiful. Then the Swami spoke. I had the impression that this person was not earthly, and I thought, here is the person I am looking for. He seemed to be different from anyone else, like he came from some other place or universe. I was attracted. After the second kirtan, the Swami and his followers rolled up their rugs, uh, picked up their instruments, and began to leave. Bob walked back to the swings on the other side of the park to find his wife and child, but the image of the Swami stayed with him. He seemed different from anyone else. His accent had been thick, yet Bob resolved to go to the storefront in a few days to hear him speak. Here is a leader, thought Bob. Dan and his wife sauntered off into the park, sampling the various groups of musicians. His wife was surprised that Dan, who was usually shy, had danced at the kirtan. He said that he said he might go over to the storefront one day and hear the Swami speak. Judy just stood there hallucinating. She held a Stay High Forever pamphlet in her hand and read it over and over and over. While she was thinking the whole event must have come from another planet, a man walked up and asked, "Would you like to go to where the Swami is?" She nodded. At the storefront, one of the devotees offered Judy some prasadam, a chapati, and then invited her up to the Swami's room. Upstairs, she entered the large front room, which was filled with fragrant smoke. There were tall flower vases and sesame seeds were on the floor. She saw the Swami bow before the little picture of Lord Chaitanya and his associates, and then stand and leave the room, closing the door behind him. Judy decided that he must have been bowing to the floor itself. Around her, everyone was softly chanting on beats, and although she couldn't make out the words, it seemed peaceful. One of the Swami's disciples took her. She told her she could come into the back room, and she followed, curious. The Swami was sitting there on his mat, looking effulgent. There were about 10 other people in the room. Prabhupada asked her if she liked the chanting in the park, and she replied, "I loved it. Do you live near here?" He asked. Judy flashed on her idea that she was the all pervading truth and answered in a way which she thought must have sounded very mystical. "Oh, I live very near." "Good," said Swamiji. "Then you can come for our morning kirtan and class." Then she realized that she didn't live so near and that it would mean traveling an hour and a half from the Bronx to visit the Swami. But she decided that since he had asked her she could come, then she thought, "I am making this up." But Prabhupada assured her, as if knowing her thoughts, "This process is nothing you have made up. It is very old, very simple, and sublime." He leaned back. "We are eternal," he said, "and everything around us is temporary." Judy was now coming down from the LSD. By the time she left the Swami, it was late. She had wanted to stay overnight, but the boys hadn't allowed her. But she was determined to join. For Bob, it seemed natural to follow up on what he had seen in the park. He began attending the evening classes and he started reading the Bhagavatam at the home and chanting. He framed the picture from the Bhagavatam dust jacket depicting the spiritual sky and placed it on his small homemade altar. He would offer flowers before the picture and sit before it chanting Hare Krishna. Bob was fascinated by the philosophy and the books and classes, and from the very beginning, he was amazed that Swamiji's teachings answered all his questions. He listened carefully and accepted. It seemed like once I had decided that he was telling the truth, I just accepted everything he said. Not that part of it was the truth, and the rest of it I would have to think about. October 19. It was Monday evening after the Sunday Kirtan in the park, and Dan arrived at the storefront for Kirtan. The Kirtan was in full swing, and when he entered, the first thing he noticed was some people playing on the innard of an upright piano leaning against the wall near the door. A boy handed him some wooden sticks, and he sat down and joined in the Kirtan. Then came the Swami's lecture, which Dan thought was long and serious about how sexual desire could causes bondage and suffering. The temple was crowded and stuffy, and Dan was shocked by the lecture, but he stayed on because he knew there would be another kirtan. He felt uneasy that the Swami's followers were all celibate, but because he liked the kirtan, he resolved to keep coming. The Swami wasn't quite what Dan had expected. He had imagined something of a light-hearted Roshi, laughing and joking, with sparkling eyes and words filled with paradox. But he found that Swami just the opposite, very straightforward and even cutting in his speech, and his mouth turned down at the corners, making him look mournful. Dan happily took to the kirtans, thinking they would aid his impersonal meditation, but the lectures kept stressing that God was a person. Dan resisted. He mentally debated with Prabhupada. He was partial to Dr. Radhakrishna's interpretation of Gita, and yet the Swami often launched ruthless attacks against such impersonal ideas. Gradually, Dan saw his impersonal barrier crumble, and he came to admit that on every count that Swami was right. Judy began attending both the morning and evening classes. She had to rise by 5 o'clock to get to the storefront on time, and her mother and father protested. But Judy didn't care. She would ride an hour and a half on the subway before dawn downtown to the Swami's meeting, where she would be the only girl present. When the Swami heard that Judy was an art student, he asked her to paint for Krishna. She set up a canvas in the front room of the apartment, and under his guidance, she began painting. For her first assignment, he asked her to paint a portrait of his Guru, Maharaj, Śrīla Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. He gave her a photo and instructed her. There should be a flower garland around Guru Maharaj's neck. The tilak should be yellowish, not white, and there should be no effulgence or halo around his head. Bob. I began chanting and studying the Srimad Bhagavatam at home and attending the Kirtan and classes at the storefront. After the last Kirtan in the evening, the Swami would take a bowl made of simulated wood and a little paring knife and a couple of apples that had been sitting on the edge of his lectern, and he would cut the apples up in a little bowl and hand the bowl to a disciple. The disciple would then offer him the first piece, and he would pop it into his mouth. The rest of the pieces of the apple would be distributed to the crowd. I remember one time when he was chewing on his piece of apple and he spit the seeds out on the floor up against the wall. They bounced off the wall onto the floor next to the dais. And I was thinking, how wonderful. No one else can do that. No one else would have the nerve to do such a thing. With his atheistic filmmaker's eye, Dan appreciated Swamiji's manner. Dan, there was a sink right next to the dais where he sat. It was so close that he could have leaned over and touched it. After cutting up an apple, he would take the scraps and just fling them into the sink. It was very casual. I was very impressed by that. And one time, Brahmananda came up and wanted 50 cents for something. And the Swami reached out and picked up his little black purse, the kind that closes by a metal clasp at the top. He snapped it open, looked inside very perspicaciously, and then his hand came up like a bird, like a eagle hovering in flight above its prey. But the hand didn't pounce. It just delicately drifted down, um, took out a 50-cent piece, and rose up on a balloon. It was graceful. It was a dance, a ballet. He just picked up his 50 cents and lifted it into Brahmananda's hand. I couldn't believe it. Someone asks you for a 50-cent piece, you just dig in your pockets and threw it and at them. But the Swami seemed to treat everything as Krishna's property, and this 50-cent piece was treated with such care. The weeks went by. Some of the devotees had spoken to Bob about initiation, but he was unsure. He didn't know exactly what initiation was, but it seemed to him that the other devotees were eager to get him initiated because he was working and had a family. To Bob's way of thinking, he represented maturity to them, a middle class American, and they were eager to land him. Bob's wife wasn't interested, and his friends were downright opposed. He couldn't spend much time with Prabhupada or the devotees since he was either at the house, at the office, or at home with his family. Bob, so they were asking me if I was interested in initiation. I said I would think about it. I hadn't stopped smoking. I hadn't made the final decision. The final real personal exchange I had with the Swami was when I asked for initiation. The rest of the time, I was so much in awe of him that it didn't occur to me to say anything. I always wanted to. I felt puffed up, and I always thought, well, I should be able to talk to him. Maybe I should do something. But I was always kind of reluctant to do it. I didn't think it was my place. I guess maybe I was afraid. But I was getting up early and chanting 32 rounds a day, many of them on subway. I was afraid of material world because I didn't have much association with the devotees, and I wanted to insulate myself by chanting more. Judy was another person who was considering initiation, and I asked her what she was going to do about it. And she said, I'm thinking about it. And then she told me she had decided she would get initiated and give up all her bad habits. I began to think maybe I could give up these things too. So I asked what to do, how to do, how do I approach him? And Kirtananda said, well, you go up to his room. I was surprised. It was so easy. I was prepared a little speech. I had prepared a little speech in my mind. My dear Swamiji, would you kindly accept me as your disciple and teach me about Krishna consciousness? I went up to his room without an appointment and knocked on the door. I heard him say, come in. I entered the room and he was sitting behind his desk. He was alone. I made obeisances and he looked at me and said, yes, yes. And I said, Swamiji, will you make me your disciple? And that's as far as I got it, as far as I got. I was going to say, and teach me the philosophy of Krishna consciousness. But he didn't let me finish my speech. He said, yes, it was so simple. I thought, well, there's nothing else to say. He has accepted me. So I thanked him and paid my obeisances and left. You know, you are not supposed to be up here unless you are initiated, Achyutananda said. Judy was flustered. She had come upstairs to put some dirty pots in the kitchen. Oh, yes, she replied. That's just what I wanted to talk to Swamiji about. And she went into Prabhupada's room, where he was talking with a few other people. Swamiji, could I please get initiated? She asked. And he said, do you know the four rules? Yes. Can you follow them? Yes. Then you can be initiated in 2 weeks. Dan was also thinking about initiation, but he wanted to wait. He was chanting 16 rounds and attending all the lectures despite his reluctant wife. He had always had difficulty with authority figures, but he could feel that the Swami was winning him over and wearing down his impersonal barrier. 2 weeks later, Prabhupada held another initiation ceremony. Bob became Rupanuga and Judy became Yadurani. Dan needed a little more time. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna. Thank you, Prabhuji, for this
Thank you.
Thank you.
mind-raising lecture.
Yeah. Hare Krishna. Okay, then we will continue our journey. Hare Krishna.
Thank you, Prabhuji.
Hare Krishna.
Wonderful. Hare Krishna.